All right, today we're going to continue in the 5 basic functions unit. Today you're going to look at quadratic functions. So you're going to need that lesson 5 handout. Should have grabbed one on the way in. You're also going to need a graphing calculator. You can use the one on your computer, but it might be easier if you have one from the class set. Before we do that though, you are going to need to correct yesterday's lesson. So this might be a little bit tricky. You might have to pause the video and then switch to your OneNote and then go back and forth. So I'm going to show you the answers to yesterday's assignment. You can correct, make sure it has a score on it, and then you can move on and take notes right on the handout as you watch the rest of this video. So here are the answers from yesterday's work. Remember, we put the black lines on the graph. That's the parent function. That's the y equals the absolute value of x. And then the other graphs are what happens to the graph. And actually, I am just noticing that there's a mistake here. This shouldn't be negative, should be positive. So A and B, that's the graph. C and D, those are the graphs. And E and F. Now, if I've gone too fast, just pause the video or rewind it so you can correct your own assignment. But I'm going to move on. Okay, so today's lesson, we're going to look at the second or third type of basic function. It's the quadratic function. It's y equals x squared. Y equals x squared is the parent function for this quadratic function. So you can write parent function. The abbreviation for function is fn. This quadratic function, y equals x squared, you can graph it on your graphing calculator. So grab your graphing calculator, turn it on, clear the memory, second plus 712, and then put in the equation y equals x squared. So to do that, you hit the y equals button. I'm going to put in the x like I did yesterday, and then to square it, it's this button right here above the log button. It's this squared button, y equals x squared. Then you hit graph. The graph of a quadratic looks like this. It's a U shape. It's called the parabola. So again, at any point if I'm going too fast, just pause the video and do this on your own calculator. But I'm going to make a sketch of what that looks like. It just looks like a U. Arrows on both ends because it goes on forever. And actually this should come right down and touch right at 0, 0. That's the parent function. That's called a parabola. So everything that I write on my screen, you should be writing on your paper. Just like the function we looked at yesterday, y equals x squared, the second equation says y equals negative x squared. So compare equations 1 and 2. What's different? It has a negative. So if I grab my graphing calculator and I graph y equals negative x squared by pressing y equals, I can arrow down. The negative button is down here by the decimal point, x squared, and then I hit graph. And what does it do? It flips it over, just like yesterday. So the graph of y equals negative x squared is just the same as the parent function, only it's flipped over, which is the answer to the second question. How does it change the graph? It flips it. So the negative sign flips it. And if you want, you can think of it like this. The negative part flips it over or flips it off. Okay. So what I'd like you to do now is, on your own, hit the pause button in the video on your own, grab your graphing calculator, and punch in y equals x squared plus 1. First, you clear out the two equations that are in there. Clear that one, arrow down, clear that one. Put in y equals x squared plus 1, and y equals x squared minus 1 and see what the graphs look like and then sketch them on to your paper. When you're ready, hit play again. Okay, so what you should have come up with is that when you add 1 to the x squared function, it just shifted the whole graph up 1. So your U shape should come down like that. And when you subtract 1, it shifts it all down 1. So your U shape or your parabola should come down like that. So just like on the absolute value function, this plus 1 will shift it up 1 place, and this minus 1 will shift it down 1. So rather than answer the 2 questions below, you should just write what I have written on my screen on your paper. The plus 1 shifts it up, the minus 1 shifts it down. And again, if I had an equation like this, y equals x squared plus 7, what happens to the parent function y equals x squared is that it gets shifted up 7. Okay, what you're going to notice in number 5 and 6 is now there are parentheses added to the equation. This is the parent function, y equals x squared, but I could write it y equals parentheses x squared. And if I add something on the outside, like plus 1, that shifted it up. In this equation, y equals x plus 2 inside the parentheses, the 2 is on the inside of the parentheses, so in this case, it's going to shift it left or right. So grab your calculator and try that. The parentheses are above the 8 and the 9 key, so it's going to be parentheses x plus 2 parentheses, and then you square it. And if you graph that, what you notice is it shifts it to the left 2 places. So 1, 2 places. There's the U shape. So just like the absolute value function, if I add 2 on the inside, it shifts it to the left. If I subtract 2, it's going to shift it to the right. 1, 2 places. Comes down. So as best you can, make these U-shaped graphs on your graphs, and then write it like we did before. Adding 2 on the inside will shift it to the left 2. And subtracting 2 on the inside will shift it to the right 2 spaces. All right, number 7 and number 8. I'm multiplying the y equals x squared function by 2, and I'm multiplying the x squared function by 1/2. So take a second, pause the video, try graphing those. Now, you're not just graphing them to get the answer, you're graphing these 2 equations to practice knowing how to graph an equation and knowing how to use the graphing calculator, because that's going to be important in chapter 5. Okay, so if you put y equals 2x squared into the calculator, what you should have noticed is the 2 on the outside made the U shape steeper. So here's the parent function. It would have looked like this. The new equation with the 2 on the outside makes the graph steeper. The 1/2 on the outside, here's the parent function. The 1/2 on the outside should have made the parabola or the graph wider. So when you draw your graphs, we're not being super accurate with the graphs. When you draw yours, just exaggerate. If it's a number on the outside like 2, make it super steep. If it's a number on the outside like 1/2, make it super wide. Okay, so the next page is just a summary of what you just saw by looking at each of those quadratic functions and their graphs. So just like we did for the absolute value, we're just going to write in some phrases that answer these questions that can be short and sweet. The equation y equals x squared makes a U-shaped graph, a U shape, or it's also called a parabola. Copy that down, pause it if you need to, but I'm going to move on. By putting a negative in front of the x squared, like this, y equals negative x squared, all it does is flip the graph. When you add a number to the y equals x squared equation, and you can think of it like you're adding it to the outside of some parentheses, but if you add a number like that, it's going to shift the graph up. When you subtract a number, it's going to shift the graph down. If you add or subtract a number on the inside of the parentheses, like this, it's going to shift the graph, and it's going to be opposite of what you'd think. Plus 2 shifts it to the left. And then if you subtract inside, it's going to shift it opposite of what you think, shift it to the right. And you may be noticing the answers to what we're writing down today is exactly the same as what we wrote yesterday. If you start multiplying a quadratic function, if you start putting numbers in front of the x squared, it's going to make the graph steeper, and it's going to be steeper if it's a number that's bigger than 1, and it's going to be wider if it's a fraction. So what happens to the quadratic function affects how the graph looks. Adding or subtracting shifts it up or down. Adding or subtracting inside the set of parentheses shifts it left or right. Putting a negative in front of it flips it over. Multiplying by a number makes it steeper or wider. So your job is to complete the last page of this assignment. There's 6 graphs. I have already put the parent function on the graph for you. Mine is done in red, yours is in black and white, but each of these red graphs is the parent function, y equals x squared. Adding a number on the outside will shift it up that many spaces. So you always start with the point at the bottom and shift that point up 1, 2, 3, and then you just redraw your parabola. So I'm going to let you complete this assignment on your own carefully. Notice some of them are flipped, some are steeper and wider. When you finish this part of it, then you're going to go to Schoology, and in the resources, in the 5 basic functions folder, you're going to notice a quiz. Your second half of the assignment is to take that quiz. If you don't do well, I have set it up so that you can try it 20 times if you feel like it. But you should take it at least twice if you don't do well the first time. Take it until you get a good score. The point of it is so that you learn how to identify graphs and match them with equations. All right, if you finish both of those assignments, please find something that will keep you from getting into trouble. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.